Hey guys, Mr. Farley here. Happy day to everybody. We're going to look today at Chapter 17, Section 3, A Promise of Freedom. A Promise of Freedom. And 17.3 is going to address the Emancipation Proclamation, which will be issued by President Lincoln to take effect January 1st, New Year's Day, 1863. Let's look at our vocab term first. Emancipate. Means to set free. So when we talk about the Emancipation Proclamation, we're talking about a statement or a proclamation that will set people free. All right, literally, emancipate means to set people free. Let's take a look at the reading here on A Promise of Freedom. On January 1st, 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. And his goal with the Emancipation Proclamation was to emancipate or free all slaves in the Confederate States. We will look at the chart in a moment and further explain exactly what Lincoln is actually accomplishing with the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln believed that the Union could be served, or the Union could be saved, by broadening the goals of the war. When we look at the war when it first began, Lincoln's initial goal upon taking office and when the war begins is to restore and force the seceding states back into the Union. Lincoln believed that the Union could be saved by broadening or adding to that original goal of saving the Union. And the goals were now to restore the Union and free the slaves. However, the Emancipation Proclamation did not free all slaves. In the Union and in Confederate lands controlled by the Union, slaves were not freed. Lincoln wanted to introduce freedom for slaves gradually, and he was not sure that Northerners would support freedom for all slaves. So the Emancipation Proclamation is very specific in the slaves that are freed. It is slaves that remain in states controlled by the Confederacy, okay? Because the rebelling states were not under Union control, no slaves, though, actually gained Union freedom on January 1st, 1863. However, the Emancipation Proclamation had important effects. We're going to talk about those effects now. First, Union troops were now fighting to end slavery as well as save the Union. Union troops were now fighting not just to save the Union, but to end slavery. Also, the Emancipation Proclamation won the Union sympathy from European countries. It became less likely now that these countries would help the Confederate States. And it made both free and enslaved African Americans enthusiastic supporters of the North. In short, the Emancipation Proclamation provided hope to both free and enslaved blacks that slavery would soon end. African Americans contributed a great deal to the Union war effort. At first, black troops faced discrimination. However, by the end of the war, large numbers of African Americans, almost 200,000, had fought for the Union. We will see some video clips in class on this from the movie Glory with Denzel Washington and Matthew Broderick. And these video clips will highlight the accomplishments and the struggles faced by the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, which was a black regiment helped to be organized by Frederick Douglass. All right. The most famous African-American unit, the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, will fight bravely at Charleston, South Carolina, at Fort Wagner. And behind Confederate lines, slaves did what they could do to weaken the Southern war effort. So the Emancipation Proclamation is also going to result in the ability of African-American slaves, former slaves, to show their abilities and to show their capabilities on the battlefield to help the Union eventually win the war. And that will be highlighted by the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. And we'll see, as I said, some video clips on them from the film Glory. Let's take a look now at the chart at the bottom of your reading. We're looking at the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, and we're going to talk about what, why, and its effects. The Emancipation Proclamation was a statement written by and issued by President Lincoln. And what it said was that all states in which slaves were enslaved that were held by the Confederacy, all slaves are now free in those Confederate states that were still fighting the Union. Now, in effect, it did not grant freedom to slaves immediately in those areas because, again, the Confederate states controlled those slaves, and the Confederate states were in control. But it did state that they were free, and it provided them hope and encouragement and enthusiasm that eventually they would become free. Why does Lincoln do it? Why does Lincoln issue the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863? Lincoln hopes to weaken the South and introduce freedom for slaves gradually. The Emancipation Proclamation was written in late summer of 1862, and it was public knowledge that it would go into effect on January 1st of 1863. Lincoln wanted to introduce the idea of slavery, of freedom for slaves gradually. The effects, as we learned in the reading, the effects of the Emancipation Proclamation, the Union troops fight to end slavery now, as well as to save the Union. Saving the Union was the primary goal when the war started. Now there is a second goal, and the second goal is to end slavery. The Union will also win sympathy from countries in Europe as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation of President Lincoln. Let's talk about the two questions that appear on the bottom now of our reading. First question related to the reading: about how many African Americans will fight for the Union during the Civil War? This question can be found directly in the reading. And question number two, the chart skills: what were the effects? What were the effects of the Emancipation Proclamation? Next up in chapter 17:4, we will look at the hardships of war. And there were plenty of them for soldiers and civilians alike. The hardships of war coming up in chapter 17, section 4.